Herbert Wells is probably one of the most frequently adapted writers in history. He may not be on Stephen King's level in terms of sheer volume, but his novels regularly make their way to the screen. Unfortunately, these adaptations often fall short in terms of quality. Perhaps this is because many of Wells's novels, such as The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, were published over 100 years ago and require heavy reworking to fit modern realities. Of course, the creative choices made by the filmmakers also play a significant role. Hollywood has adapted The Time Machine countless times. The 1960 version is considered a classic in the U.S. and is arguably the best adaptation of Wells's novel in cinematic history. In the late 1990s, Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks Pictures also decided to tackle the story. The Time Machine quickly became one of the most anticipated releases. But, as often happens, something went wrong. The failure of The Time Machine was a major surprise for Hollywood. At the time, DreamWorks was just starting out, and nearly everything it touched turned to gold. Sometimes a lot of gold, sometimes not as much, but there was always some. Well, almost always. Everyone expected this expensive and ambitious project, which had been in development for years, to be a massive success. In the 1990s, director Simon Wells, the great-grandson of H.G. Wells, expressed a strong desire to adapt The Time Machine. After all, who better to bring Wells's novel to the big screen than his own relative? Simon Wells spent a great deal of time pursuing director Steven Spielberg and pitching his vision for the film. He began this pursuit while working on the animated films Balto and We're Back, A Dinosaur's Story. Both projects were developed at Amblin Entertainment, Spielberg's production company, giving Wells plenty of opportunities to reach him. Neither film performed well at the box office, though Balto eventually found success on home video. By then, Spielberg had formed an opinion about Wells's abilities, and as a result, he took an interest in the proposal. Moreover, having a Wells at the helm provided a unique marketing advantage, making it easier to promote the film and attract audiences. However, working on a smaller project is one thing. Directing a big-budget blockbuster is another. To test Wells's ability to handle a larger production, he was assigned as one of the directors on the animated film The Prince of Egypt. The project was already in development at DreamWorks, which at the time was striving to compete with Disney in animation. The Prince of Egypt performed well at the box office and received positive feedback from both critics and audiences. While not a massive hit, it became DreamWorks' biggest success in traditional animation. The $70 million production grossed $218 million worldwide, won an Academy Award, and received several nominations. Pleased with the results, Spielberg gave Simon the green light to direct The Time Machine. To minimize financial risk in case of failure, DreamWorks brought Warner Brothers on board to handle international distribution, while DreamWorks retained control over the U.S., Canadian, and home video markets. This wasn't due to mistrust. As a young studio, DreamWorks simply didn't have the infrastructure to handle global distribution on its own. At the time, the company frequently partnered with other studios to split the costs of their films. The studio initially allocated $70 million for the film, with the lead role going to Guy Pearce, who had gained recognition for his performances in L.A., Confidential, Ravenous, and Memento. At the time, Pearce was seen as a rising star, and having his name on the film's posters lent it credibility. Additionally, he was still relatively affordable. Filming took place mostly on sound stages, and for the first few weeks, production proceeded without major issues. However, one problem quickly arose. Guy Pearce caused delays. Determined to do all his own stunts, he ended up breaking a couple of ribs while performing a flip in one of the scenes. His enthusiasm for stunt work quickly wore thin with the crew, and he was strictly prohibited from pulling a Jackie Chan on set. Unhappy with this restriction, Pearce frequently argued with the director, insisting he wouldn't get injured again. However, no one wanted further delays, so his objections were ignored. The real trouble started a few weeks before filming wrapped. Official reports state that, about a month before completion, Simon Wells was replaced by Gore Verbinski due to extreme exhaustion. Allegedly, Wells had been working so hard for 2 months that he began fainting on set. He would be helped up, only to collapse again a few hours later. Since Verbinski had a short break between working on The Mexican and The Ring, both DreamWorks productions, he was quickly brought in to take over the time machine, while Wells was sent to recover. However, rumors suggest a different story. According to insiders, the studio was deeply disappointed with the early footage they had received. Simon Wells was considered a visionary director. His early career included work on Back to the Future Part 2, helping to create its futuristic world. But after transitioning to animation, where directing responsibilities differ significantly, he seemed to have lost his touch with live-action filmmaking. When executives reviewed the footage, they reportedly felt that Wells had become too fixated on the film's visuals, treating everything else, such as story and pacing, as secondary. Moreover, a couple of weeks into filming, Wells fired the second unit director and replaced him with Raja Gosnell, who had directed Home Alone 3 and later went on to direct Scooby-Doo After the Time Machine. In a later interview with the Los Angeles Times, Guy Pearce admitted he didn't fully understand the reason for the replacement. However, it appears that the second unit director had been giving Wells advice that Wells, unsurprisingly, didn't agree with. Regardless, after Simon Wells fainted yet again, he was sent on a well-deserved break, and Gore Verbinski stepped in to finish the film. At this stage, the time machine underwent major changes. The script was rewritten on the fly, introducing a new character played by Jeremy Irons and adding a romantic subplot for Guy Pearce's character. Initially, there was no real focus on romance. It was meant to be more of a subtle attraction. The film simply needed a female character who would provide guidance to Pearce's protagonist, and he would appreciate her for it. However, as the rewrites progressed, Pearce's character began behaving strangely around her, and the filmmakers decided to add an unexpected woman in distress twist. In one of his interviews, Pearce expressed his frustration with everything happening on set. He claimed that he had signed up for one film, but ended up working on something completely different. Furthermore, when he saw the final version in theaters, he was even more shocked. It felt like a third, entirely different film. According to the actor, some of his character's scenes were filmed without his participation. For example, in one scene where he and Samantha Mumba's character are shown holding hands, Pearce insisted it wasn't his hand, but someone else's. He stated that they had never shot that scene with him, and it wasn't even in the original plans. According to official reports, Simon Wells remained involved in the editing process during post-production, working alongside Gore Verbinski. Therefore, it would be inaccurate to say that Wells had no hand in the final version of the film. However, the biggest blow to the film's second half came from the studio and Verbinski, who completely overhauled the final act. On top of that, the new director reshot several scenes in the middle of the film. But the problems didn't end there. Once the film was finished, the studio realized that one scene depicted a city being destroyed, a sensitive subject given the events of September 11, 2001. With the film originally slated for a December 2001 release, this scene made it clear that delaying the premiere was the only viable option. The release was postponed by 4 months, landing on a significantly less favorable date. Additionally, many other films that had been delayed in the wake of 9/11 were now scheduled for release in early 2002, leading to intense competition at the box office. The Time Machine hit theaters in early March 2002 and debuted at #1 in its opening weekend. However, its success was short-lived. The following week saw the release of 3 major films, Ice Age, Resident Evil, and Showtime, all competing for audience attention. With American viewers giving The Time Machine mediocre reviews and critics tearing it apart, the film quickly dropped to 4th place and continued to slide from there. With a final production budget of $80 million, the film grossed only $56 million at the domestic box office. On top of that, DreamWorks had spent over $30 million on marketing in the U.S. The international box office added another $66 million, but it wasn't enough to prevent Warner Brothers from taking a financial hit. Disappointed by the film's failure, Guy Pearce reportedly retreated to Australia for a month, isolating himself in a remote cabin far from civilization. Rumor has it he spent his time testing his body's ability to withstand copious amounts of alcohol. Even Stan Winston's studio, which designed the Morlocks for the Time Machine, faced backlash after the film's failure. Both critics and audiences heavily criticized the studio's work on the creatures. The designers responded aggressively, arguing that they always specify the intended use of their designs. The Morlocks, they explained, were created specifically for dark settings and caves. They pointed out that designing creatures that look equally effective in both daylight and darkness is nearly impossible. Normally, additional adjustments are made when the same monster appears in different lighting conditions. Furthermore, according to the designers, their original Morlock designs had been altered by someone at the studio, making them look far worse than intended. While Stan Winston's studio received most of the criticism, the designers placed the blame on the filmmakers for using the creatures in ways they weren't designed to be used. Ironically, The Time Machine still received an Oscar nomination for Best Makeup, but lost to Frida. The film's failure had the greatest impact on Guy Pearce and Simon Wells. Before The Time Machine, Pearce had built an impressive resume with films like L.A. Confidential, Memento, Rules of Engagement, and Ravenous. However, after this flop, he spent several years starring in smaller British and Australian productions, with only Factory Girl standing out. It wasn't until the late 2000s that he managed to make a comeback, though major lead roles in Hollywood films became rare for him. Simon Wells' career took an even bigger hit. He attempted a comeback a decade later with the ambitious animated project Mars Needs Moms, but it became one of the biggest box office disasters of 2011. Effectively ending both Robert Zemeckis' studio and Wells' directing career. Since then, he hasn't directed another film. It would be interesting to see Wells' original version of The Time Machine to determine whether he was responsible for the film's shortcomings or if the studio's interference led to a watered-down, simplified final product. Unfortunately, with this movie, even dreaming of such a thing is pointless. As for Steven Spielberg, The Time Machine ended up having a surprisingly positive impact on his career. A few years later, he directed War of the Worlds, which performed significantly better at the box office. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned.